Good evening. Welcome to an evening with the Maine Monitor. We're so proud to welcome all of you guys to the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting, which was founded back in 2009 and has a more pressing mission now more than ever. As a mom here in Brunswick and as a veteran journalist, I just see the need for public treating journalism as a public good to protect our democracy. And that's why we're gathered here tonight. Many of us get the daily paper, but the Maine Monitor covers all of Maine and is nonpartisan, anti-polarization, doing investigative journalism that so many of our legacy newspapers don't have the budget for anymore. And we're sharing our content with the Press Herald, the Sun Journal, and it's being picked up all over the state now that we have our new editor, Eric Conrad, on board. He got his start back at the Kennebec Journal and Morning Sentinel with our founders, Naomi and John, who you'll hear from soon. And we're so proud to introduce you tonight to our four enterprising reporters who are all supported by Report for America, one of whom has just won a national recognition for her report in conjunction with ProPublica on Maine's staggering lack of a public defender system as the only state in the country that doesn't have publicly funded indigent defense. And so that is why we're here. We welcome your questions. We welcome your story tips. We are a nonprofit donor-funded newsroom, so we very much welcome your donations and spread the word about our daily newsletter. I don't know about you, but I really came to depend on the Maine Monitor during COVID. The daily COVID tracker newsletter showing us the case stats and coverage from around the state in one newsletter was an invaluable resource. And we've kept our daily newsletter up, letting you know everything you need to know in Maine in one email. We're the go-to source for statewide news that connects us across the political spectrum and across all our demographic differences, which is vital if we want to stay together as a state and a country. We need good journalism. And yes, I guess now I just want to turn it over to our founders, John Christie and Naomi Shalit, who will be interviewed by our veteran original board president, Jed Davis, who has been with them since the beginning. Take it away, Naomi, John, and Jed.
Jed, are you actually interviewing us? You got to take yourself off mute. Bad start here. Bottom of the screen.
Oh, wait a minute.
There you
go. I would be afraid to interview you, Naomi.
Okay, so John and I both have cheat sheets here. So why don't we just divide it as we talked about before. I think John's going to start. I'll go next and you can wrap us all up. I have been asked to say that as you heard already from Laura, we invite your questions and we'll pause with a few minutes to go in this segment and throughout the program to take them. To ask a question, look at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat. Don't use that. Do the Q&A that's the one on the right, the function there, and type in your questions. And our wonderful new editor, Eric Conrad, will moderate these throughout the night. So John, time for you to talk about those wonderful old days.
Well, I was asked to explain how it began, and so it will take a few moments, but I'll start that. From 2000 to 2009, I was the publisher of the Kennebec Journal and the Morning Sentinel, two daily papers in central Maine, owned by the Seattle Times Company. They went for sale, and in the middle of 2009, they were sold. And I was the publisher, and the new owner didn't want me to stay on as publisher, and I was very happy given who he was, not to stay on as publisher and get my freedom. So what do I want to do with my freedom at age 61? Well, the thing that's the most fun that I enjoy doing the most in my, decades of journalism is investigative journalism. Writing, editing, reporting, investigative journalism is the most satisfying thing I did in journalism. And also, by the way, the most fun. So that was my impulse was to do that. At the same time, Naomi and I were talking about what was needed in journalism. And I think as Laura spoke earlier, newspapers' budgets were going down dramatically. Investigative journalism costs a lot of money. You got to take a reporter off his or her beat for weeks or perhaps months, and maybe the story doesn't even turn out. State-House reporting, particularly of the investigative nature in Maine, was on the downside. Once there were 20 reporters covering the State-House in Maine, they were down to 5 at this point. And Naomi and I were both veteran State-House reporters, she in Maine and me in Massachusetts. So there was this need that we saw, and also this personal desire to do something along these lines. And so those two things came together to say, hey, we ought to do investigative reporting in Maine. But, you can do it. It doesn't magically appear somewhere. I'm not part of any organization. I'm going to do this stuff. What's going to happen to it afterwards? Well, you have to have an organization. It was around that time that I noticed that at BU, at Boston University, somebody had started something called a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Hadn't heard of that before. Looked into it, found out there were just a few of these things happening. It sounded like the kind of thing we should do. So, and happened to know the dean at BU. We were colleagues in South Florida when I was at the paper in Fort Lauderdale. He was the one in Miami. We were on all our talk shows together. His name's Tom Fiedler. Doug may know him. He probably does. So, Tom Fiedler, yes. Tom gave me some advice. BU organization gave us some advice. Decided to start our own organization. And that's how we began to put something together. Naomi and I, along with our first board member, Mary Mayo, who may be on this call, I'm not sure. It's like a lot of things with the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting, a long phrase. It was done at the kitchen table. So the three of us sat down with a little whiskey, a little scotch, and did incorporation papers and got started with an organization. So we had some ideas about how to do things. We had no money. We had a first story idea. But one of the things we did was and I've got it right in front of me right now, is to write a mission statement, a vision statement. I called it our manifesto. And this is what we said. Our stories will be widely available to all types of media in the state as a public service. No citizen should lack access to the information based on their income. The stories written by the center will be respected because they will be seen as intended, as journalism that favors no political party, no ideology, and no special interest. So those are the things that we were equal opportunity offenders. We had no ideology. We weren't liberals. We weren't conservatives. We didn't really care about that stuff. We wanted good, hot shit, investigative reporting that got people's attention. That was our point. We wanted to specialize, by the way, in government. We eschewed politics for the most part. Everybody could write about who's running, who's ahead, who's back, what the polls say. Everybody could, we had no opinion, no political writing, strictly deep dives into government and what's going wrong and who's responsible. So we spent, a good part of 2009 setting up the organization, again, with no money, used our own money at the beginning to get things going, and had an idea for a story. And I got the idea for the story because, as my friends here know, I play a lot of golf. And one day I was on a golf course and I saw the governor of the state of Maine at a charity event that I was at. And in his cart was the head of the real estate agency, a real estate realtors group in Maine. Thought, she probably paid for the governor to be in this charity tournament. And that stuck in my mind because that's how politics work. So the first story we did revealed the fact that the governor of Maine at the time, Governor John Baldacci, had changed a law to revise and reform the state's tax system, but he left out two groups. One was the ski industry because of his contacts here. One was the realtors. They didn't get hit by the new tax law. And so we exposed the fact that the governor was able to say, I'll sign this new tax law, but only if you let out the ski business and the real estate business, and expose the connections the governor had to those two businesses. And that's how we began. That story was published on the front page of the Sun Journal and the Bangor Daily News, because our stories from then till now have been given at no cost to the media, because we're a public service, we're a nonprofit. You don't get a nonprofit status if you can't say to the IRS, hey, we've got a public service here. We're, in our case, it was educational. We're not trying to make money off this. We're trying to educate people, expose people, inform people. So that's how we get going. And there were lots of things that got in our way. We almost fell apart many times, but we stuck with it. People like Jed, particularly, we have a lot of war stories we could say about how we almost died multiple times. And we're so glad now that the organization is in the hands of Eric, with Barbara's help, I'm sure, and somebody we can trust and we know. And Jed is stuck with us, and Nick is still with us. So we're grateful for that. And I will get into some more war stories later if there's time.
Actually, I want to ask you to tell one more story, which is people I'm sure want to know how we get stories. And there was one story you were digging about how the members of the Baldacci administration had ended up getting really cushy they had to show up, but they were very cushy jobs at the University of Maine. And one day you got what every investigative reporter wants, which is what?
The unmarked brown envelope with documents inside. Yeah, somebody else at the humane system was also concerned about this, and it heard we were working on this story. I think another one of those intuitions we had about, wow, how come that person got a job up there when she really isn't qualified for that job? And maybe some other people got jobs they weren't really qualified for, because as Baldacci's term was ending and he couldn't run again, he had to make sure that people who worked for him were loyal to him, got some jobs that couldn't be taken away from them after the political scene changed. And so he opened that envelope, and there were lots of more details about other people we didn't know about who gotten jobs they may or may not been qualified for at the University of Maine system. And I think that was also the story that led us to lose a board member. Wasn't it, Naomi?
No, that was the one about the Maine Green Energy Alliance.
No, the other board member.
Oh, yes. We've
Right.
lost a few. Yes. Which kind of leads into what
She ran one of the university schools, and they were one of the stories that came up. So she nicely bowed out.
There are other media organizations. There's one in particular that uses the phrase "without fear or favor." I believe it was the New York Times. And we certainly had that motto ourselves as well. We had to be willing to, as John said to me early on, we have no friends. The truth is we did. Many of them are here and still involved with the organization and believed in what we wanted to do. But we had to go into every story without fear and without believing we needed to grant favor to anyone. The early days, in the first few years especially, we were making something so new that funders that we went to in the state of Maine, they didn't even know how to think of us. They were used to giving money to services. They were used to giving money to soup kitchens. They were used to giving money to basically nicey things that are all important and need philanthropic support. But they were not used to giving money to an organization that would go bite their friends, which we did many times. There was one Maine funder who came through without even being asked. That was Maddie Corson, who gave us our first donation. She chased John after he was leaving a meeting and gave him a check. It was a wonderful vote of confidence in us. But we were literally told by the head of a large Maine funder that they were scared by what we did. National journalism funders, we actually ended up with a couple of them that I believe are still with the organization, both of them journalism funders, the Ottaway Foundation and the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. Both of those companies had come out of local newspapers and understood the value of local news. But in fact, the large funders were going to ProPublica. Mr. Sandler was giving $10 million a year there. His editor-in-chief was earning a salary that could have carried us for about 3 or 4 years. So that was very hard, that early time. And we did a lot of talking about the role of journalism in democracy and how it isn't just a national issue, it's a local issue. And John and I did talks at libraries, at Rotaries, at colleges, at you name it, all around the state. I still remember one trip in a blizzard coming home from Blue Hill, and after talking to 10 people and thinking, God, we're going to die for that. And but bit by bit, we helped educate Maine about the role that journalism plays in democracy. And honestly, we were one of the first about dozen groups that did this kind of work. We were really in the vanguard. And in fact, the New England Center no longer exists, the one out of Boston University. So it's quite a testament to the work of the people who came after us that this has been sustained. We were really looking for malfeasance and misfeasance. There was a fair amount of it. There hadn't been, in our early documents, we said there were 20 reporters covering state government 20 years before we were started. That was down to 10 years before we started. And the year we started, there were 5 reporters in the State House, including us, covering state government. So the diminishment, they used to have reporters who covered the actual different departments: agriculture, health and human services, education. None of that ever happened. It just became sort of the daily political fight that got talked about in the news, and not the more substantive things that needed serious investigative reporting. We were also, well, I'll stop there except to say that some of the stories that I certainly loved doing were when I got to page something like 87 in the state's financial audit and found a footnote that led me to a story about how state officials, state legislators, there was a loophole in state law that allowed the state to pay almost $235 million to private organizations run by legislative leaders or the spouses of high-level officials from 2003 to 2010 without requiring any disclosure, because the disclosure required you to be paid directly by the state. And if you weren't paid directly, if it was a corporation like Joseph Brannigan in the State House for a very long time, who ran Shalom House, worked for, he could get tens and tens and tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars sent to his organization without anyone on the outside knowing it. So that was a great story to get onto. They actually changed the ethics rules as a result of that. John and I got some really juicy stuff around Representative John Martin, who was long thought to be one of the biggest powers in the State House. We found that he had problems paying off taxes and loans from 2 government agencies. That was after he'd gone bankrupt and owed the Irving Company about, I think it was $250,000. And the way he paid that back was to introduce legislation very favorable to them. And John, did you have a favorite story?
You know, it's a story that isn't one of my favorite stories, my favorite events though. And we got the lobbyist for the Maine Municipal Association, and Eric wasn't the lobbyist, somebody else, came to me and said, you know, my job is to figure out what's going on with the state budget so I can tell the cities and towns what's going on. Reasonable thing. But I can't get any information because, do you know, John, that the budget committees for the legislature don't have public meetings. They have public meetings, but all the work's done in a private meeting. And I looked up the law, and he had done the same thing and found out that that really wasn't legal. So I thought I'll go to one of these meetings. So I show up at the State House one day, and they're having a meeting, a budget meeting. Then they adjourn the meeting for what I understand is the real budget meeting, and it's inside a door, inside a door, inside a door. And I can't really figure out which door it is, but I know one of the members of the committee, who's actually somebody I know very well from Augusta, and I see him come out of the door, beside the door, and I say, Roger, where's this meeting? It's going to this budget meeting. Well, you got to go in here, John, and then go through this corridor, and it's this other meeting, but don't go in there. That's a closed meeting. I say, oh, thank you very much. Well, I'm a member of the public, and they're spending my money. So I go through one of the doors, go down the corridor, turn a left, and see another door that I think might be the door, and walk in. And there is the budget committee, Democrats, Republicans, deciding how to spend money. And they say, you can't come in here. This is a private meeting. I say, no, I cite the law. I say, no, here's the statute. This means to be public. Says, well, the chairman says to me, we don't want to have a public meeting, because if we have a public meeting, we can't get things done without people knowing what we're doing. If they know what we're doing, we won't actually have a real meeting. I said, well, I don't, here's the law. I'm staying in this meeting. I don't care. And so it was kind of one of my favorite stories to do, even wasn't probably had the biggest impact.
Jed.
I met John and Naomi at Slate's restaurant one night. They told me about this organization that they had started, and I was really full of admiration that they gave up their successful careers to do something that would improve the state of Maine so significantly. Investigative journalism is essential to the health of democracy. Studies have shown that when newspapers disappear from areas, the interest of the voters goes down. And that is a death knell for democracy. And so I was pleased to join the board many years ago. And as John indicates, we've had lots of close calls. I've had a lot of experience with Maine nonprofits, and it's typical that when the founders of a nonprofit retire, the nonprofit can't continue. And we faced that because John and Naomi did everything. They did the business side, the editorial side, and we couldn't afford at that time to hire two people to replace them. And we couldn't find one person who could do it all. And so we actually got into negotiations with the New England Center down in Boston about them taking us over. And those negotiations went a long way. And, at the last minute, we found someone, and we struggled along. And then, 3 years ago, we found Dan Dinsmore, and he found us, and Dan really saved this organization. And the improvement between when Dan started and when he left recently was just astonishing.
Whoops, did we lose Jed?
We did.
Oh dear.
Yeah, you might want to just take over there, Naomi.
Yeah, I'm sad to lose Jed, but it's a nice thing to have more time for stories, just to be kind of awful about it. John, more stories? Oh, okay, I have a story. We were looking into the administration of the state's dam safety program, which we found was, in fact, very much behind in its inspections. And that was a safety issue for people in the state. You have a dam that Okay, I'll go through these quickly and then you can talk some more. You have a dam that's not in good condition. It can bust and drown people below it, certainly create property damage. We found that there was a dam safety inspector. He was an employee of the state, and he was always complaining that he didn't have enough time to get to all the dams in the state to inspect them on the schedule that he was supposed to inspect them on. And this is how sometimes the news business works. We were at dinner at the home of friends in East Benton, Maine. And they had always had Colby students come and eat dinner once a month at their home. And they had two girls there, I think they were juniors, who were rugby players. And so we asked them about what they did. They asked us about what we did. And they said, what story are you working on now? And we said, well, we're working on the story about the state dam inspector and the dams and how dangerous they are and how we can't inspect them all. And they said, John.
Oh, you mean Tony? He's also our rugby coach. And I said, well, when do you have your rugby games and practices? They said, oh, middle of the afternoon, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, or Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and the games, same time. I said, oh, now I think I know why Tony doesn't have time to inspect all the dams, because he's up coaching rugby in the middle of the workday.
So John went up there with a camera, hid behind the evergreens at the parking lot, and got a picture of Tony pulling up in his state truck with all sorts of rugby material in the back of it, correct?
Yep. And he coached these kids, in the middle of his workday. And so, we confronted him about it afterwards, and at that point, LePage was governor, and I thought he would be pretty upset about it, actually, because, he always claims to be a tough administrator and, ran a tough shop at Martin's, and some reason he didn't care. But the dams did not, they still weren't terribly inspected. But I don't know what happened to Tony. I never went back to find out.
I think he retired pretty soon after
He
that.
retired pretty soon afterwards, yeah.
Jed, back to you.
Well, these are just a few of the stories that we've covered that are so important. I mean, think about what would have happened if these stories hadn't been covered, and how much would be lost if there's no one doing this in the future. The reality is that the newspaper business is struggling, to put it mildly. And you heard the numbers about how few investigative reporters there are in the state, aside from our organization. But I just want to close by saying that it was a great pleasure working with John and Naomi, who were friends. And I miss working with them. But to be honest, the thing I miss most is that every year,
I'll give you some. I'll make it for you.
Every year, Naomi would spend days making jam, and then she would send out these jars with lovely labels of journalism jam to all the supporters of our organization. And I still have one or two of those jars around, but Naomi, I hate to say it, but that's what I miss most.
That's fine. I have different aspects of my personality, and Jed will be sending you some more jam. And I think John and I both feel very strongly that we may have started this organization, but it was Jed who kept it going. And kept it going through a few circles of hell at a certain point. And his devotion to not only the organization, but what it stands for, which is free speech and democracy, is incredibly inspiring. And I hope you live to 120, Jed. Okay. So I should turn this over to Eric now, who I will say did not get his start at the Kennebec Journal. He got his start in Pennsylvania. I think he was not wet behind the ears when the three of us happily worked together at the KJ and the Sentinel. We've been talking about the past and the present, and Eric's going to introduce you to the future of Maine journalism. Wonderful reporters, Rose Lundy, Andrew Howard, and Kate, is it Koff or Cuff?
just like it looks, unfortunately.
Okay, cough, to talk about their backgrounds and the issues and stories they're covering.
Before we do that, I just want to say a couple things. First of all, John, I remember that story that you did about the budget committee, and they used to use the term off mic, and that was like when they were meeting
Right.
privately. And a very interesting thing about that story, I think, compared to today, is where journalism is now, 12 years later, is that you used the first person approach in part of that story, if I recall correctly, and that was considered almost like unheard of then. Very common now, and actually not a bad technique if used appropriately. Do you want to talk about that and what the reception was a little bit? Because I remember you and I discussing it at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I was really, it reminded me of the fact that in all the years Naomi and I were in the organization, we used one anonymous source in one story for one paragraph. We eschewed anonymous sources 99.9% and never thought we'd put the first person in any story. But it just was no other way to explain the confrontation at the meeting, and to say that the chairman said, "Oh no," well, who did she say "oh no" to? I mean, it would just be false not to put that in there. You would have no way to tell the story. And the Press Herald did not run the story because there was a first person in it. Well, it's a good rule not to use a first person. It's a good rule not to have anonymous sources, but it's a bad rule to follow these things slavishly and not have any flexibility. So that was a controversy that happened there. And, sometimes it isn't any way to tell a story. When I was a reporter at the State House in Massachusetts in whatever decade that was, I went undercover as in a state hospital to expose the conditions in that state hospital. Undercover had to, I used my real name, but I didn't say I was a reporter, because then I couldn't get the job as an attendant and get the story. There are rules you follow 90% of the time, 99% of the time, but you have to, as a journalist, realize that if you want to get the story, and that's the only way to do it, and it's a really important story to get, you're going to have to be a little more flexible. And then you tell the readers why you did it, or why you did it, what the background is. I believe the word we're using now is transparency. I used to just say, tell the truth.
Yeah. All right. Well, John, Naomi, Jed, thank you very much. I just want to say, I've started here. It's my 12th week. They said it wouldn't last, but it's really the one of the highlights of my late career to be able to step in and take the baton in an organization that two of my lifelong friends, Naomi and John, founded. I hope to do you guys justice, because I know the blood, sweat, and tears you put into this in those early years, because I was in touch with you obviously that whole time. I also want to say the 3 years that we were working together at the Kennebec Journal and the Morning Sentinel, John was the publisher, Naomi was the editorial page editor, I was the editor. Were three of the best years of my career too. And during those years, John and Naomi did an incredible project about hunger in Maine that I tried to stay out of the way of mostly, and it won a New England Newspaper Association Public Occurrences Award, and I think would go down in the annals of those papers that have been around a long, long time as one of the best things that they ever did. So Naomi, if I was there, I'd give you a big hug. John, I'd let you beat me at golf yet again if I was there. And it's just it really is an honor for me to be taking over. And Jed's been a great partner already, and I know that's going to continue going forward. I also want to just talk a little bit about the board, because you guys have met Laura now, you've met Jed, you're soon going to hear from Doug Warren and Nick Mills. You won't hear from Amanda Cooley tonight, a fantastic board member. That's because she's been working quietly behind the scenes with me. We're making a new revenue hire, and she's been putting in a lot of time with me doing that. But I'm getting paid to be here tonight, and so are the reporters, and our 5 board members, especially Jed, who's been there from almost the beginning, don't. And they're doing it because they're committed to the kind of investigative journalism that we all believe in, that we hope all 60 plus of you who are watching tonight believe in. I just want to honor the board for doing that. It's really an important role. I couldn't do it without you, obviously, just getting started. And I think that's an important thing too. We also want to, and Jed already did this, I want to tip my hat to my predecessor. For the past 3 years plus, Dan Dinsmore has been running this shop very much in the same capacity that I hope to. Dan and I go back to 2001 together, when I was the managing editor of the Portland Press Herald, and I was looking for a sports editor and recruited him out of the Midwest, and we've been friends ever since. He's had an awesome career in Maine. over the last 20 years. And if you're out there watching, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. So now I am going to introduce you to our three of our up and coming stars, and I want to talk to Rose, Andrew, and Kate. Let's have a little fun here. First of all, I'm going to introduce you and that kind of stuff, and I just want to kind of keep this casual. But I'm going to start with Rose, with you. You know, you are our public health reporter. You're covering public health, you're covering COVID, you're covering medical care, which really is the story of our time right now. I mean, there's a lot of things going on other topics, but I think if most people in the world right now pick one story, it would be right on your beat. So why don't you talk to us just a little bit about, you know, this is your second year here, I believe, being in Maine, covering this beat, what your approach is, and maybe what some of the best stories that you feel like you've had so far and looking forward are.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, it's a very fascinating time to be a health reporter at a time when health is at the forefront of everybody's mind. Over the last 2 years, what we've all kind of been through. It's interesting. I've had a lot of experts tell me over the past year that before COVID-19, the general public didn't have an idea of what public health really meant. And that has really changed dramatically now. We talk about it all the time, and it's on our news and in our social media. And so it's really at the forefront of people's minds, which makes it a very interesting time to be a reporter and be part of that conversation. Part of that challenge would be that there are times when it feels like every other journalist in the state is writing about health. And so it can be a little bit exciting and interesting to think of new angles to write about that haven't already been covered. But part of the privilege of being with the Maine Monitor is that we really get the time to kind of step back and think about what are some other parts of the story that haven't had as much attention, and what can we really talk about. And so I think some of my stories have been on the pandemic, looking at volunteers from the state stepping in to help nursing homes that were understaffed, or certainly heat and food insecurity at a time when people are already struggling with a pandemic. But then there's also many other aspects of health that aren't only related to the pandemic. So I got to do a story on lead poisoning from lead paint, but also has been an extra challenge during the pandemic when there aren't as many people getting to go in and monitor these things. So it's been a challenging time for everybody, but it has been really interesting to be a health reporter thinking about these challenges in a new way when everybody else is thinking about it too.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that nursing home story that you just referenced, because I think you did that in partnership, if I'm not mistaken, with American University, which is another great thing about the Monitor. We don't necessarily just have to fly solo here. We can reach out to state, regional, and national partners on projects like that. You know, as somebody whose father is about maybe ready to enter a facility like that, that is an issue that for families, when it happens, is incredibly emotional. And one of the things that I think a family member like me will look toward is, you know, does that staff that's paying attention, hopefully, to my dad, are they there? Are they committed? Are they permanent? Why don't you tell the readers a little bit about, the viewers a little bit about what you found and any impact that you think it might have had?
Yeah, so I published a story over the summer with Braden Waddell. We looked at rates of contracted staff within nursing homes. And so what that means essentially is nursing homes for a long time have used agency nurses and certified nursing assistants to fill gaps in staff and when there have been emergencies, and they just need a couple of extra people on deck to help out. But what we found is that the hourly rates of contracted staff have nearly doubled since 2017, which shows that more and more nursing homes are relying on this sort of emergency measure in order to fill staffing shortages. And so it's a workforce shortage problem, but it's also a financial challenge for these nursing homes because these agency staffing members can be much, much more expensive. And so it can be kind of a bad cycle once you start relying more and more on agency workers. And then certainly it's a huge challenge for the people who live in these homes and receive this care because there's a lot of turnover and you might have new faces and you don't have the same relationships with the people providing the care. So it is an alarming story to see those numbers rising. And since that story published, we have learned that multiple Maine nursing homes recently announced that they would be closing and cited staffing problems, staffing shortages as a big part of the problem. And a couple of them had been nursing homes that saw 30% increases in contracted hours since 2017. Although one of them didn't have any contracted hours. So you can't say it across the board, but I do think our investigation kind of set the tone and perhaps is even could be a harbinger of some challenges that these nursing homes could face going forward, especially with the additional challenges during the pandemic.
Great, Rose. I think it's important that people know that journalists are human beings too. And I know your parents were just in town and in the state for a week or week and a half, 2 weeks. Might have been, correct me if I'm wrong, their first visit to Maine. What was that like? And you're being from, I think, Minnesota. What was that like? And what was maybe their one big takeaway, or they just still maybe tease you about it or something? I don't know.
I don't know, but my dad is on here tonight. So hi, Dad. Yeah, they're from Minnesota. They came out just like a week ago, and we went all over Acadia, and we went to the White Mountains and did a lot of hiking and exploring. And they thought Maine was beautiful. They're very jealous that I get to live here. So I think they're happy that I'm here, and I'm certainly happy to be here too.
Well, we're happy that you're here too, Rose. So I'm gonna move it on. Let's move it on to Andrew. I want to talk to Andrew Howard a little bit. You think for people that might think Minnesota to Maine is a big move, I'm going to introduce you to a guy who just moved here really recently from Arizona, Arizona State University's proudest, Andrew Howard, who's covering the state government for us, politics, legislature, agencies. Got a big plate, a lot of stuff on his plate. And before we get into your beat, Andrew, which I do want to talk to you about, a little bit off script here, but tell our listeners what that national story that you sort of got some renown for at Arizona State. I know.
I wasn't prepped for that one.
Let's start with that. But I know it kind of to drop in your lap. I know the story, but it's still fascinating because I think sometimes, and John references, sometimes reporters are just in the right place at the right time and talented enough to pull it off. So let's start with that, and then we'll go back into your beat now, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, my junior year of college, I was managing editor of my student newspaper, and it was right when the whistleblower report came out in the Trump administration. And so we just did like a Command F search for names of people in Arizona in that. And we found out that one of the people who was named, Kurt Volker, happened to run the McCain Institute, which is a think tank that's part of ASU. And then it also just so happened that we had a meeting with a bunch of high-level university officials that we only got once a year the same day. So we asked them about it, and we found out that he was resigning and leaving the Trump administration. And so then that was like a whirlwind of 5 days of like being on CNN and in national media and stuff like that. But it did fall in our lap in many ways. And but it was an exciting week, and it was pretty fun to scoop everyone. A lot of people in DC were not too happy with us at the time, actually. So it was great. But that was something I did in college, and now I'm here. So
yeah, it's serendipity, but you also have to be able to handle it when it falls your way. And I'm sure you did a great job of it. You're on the state government beat now, and that's a huge beat. You and I have talked about it many times already. What's one of your biggest surprises, maybe, or takeaways or challenges that you feel now that you're just getting started with us?
Yeah, I feel like I've learned a lot already. I'm still drinking from the fire hose a little bit in terms of how state government here works. I was fairly, interested to know a couple rules that I hadn't known about before, which is how few statewide positions are elected here. Back home, everything's elected. And then the other thing, which I sort of learned through a story that I wrote, was that there is no process to recall any elected officials here, at least statewide offices. So I was talking to someone who had created this online petition to impeach the governor, which obviously they can't do without the legislature. And I learned, through that, well, even though 40,000 people have signed this thing, there's actually no route for them to take to remove Mills from office. Now, as someone who's upset about mask and vaccine mandates and things like that, But at the same time, it was interesting to know that, if you're on the other end of it, they felt semi-powerless and that there was actually no avenue to take in that situation. So that was something I learned, and part of a story that I wrote recently. Yeah.
Well, let's open that story up. Good segue, because that was a woman, I think out of York County. I don't want to give the story away, but she went online, got those signatures. Why don't you outline the story, and then you and I can talk a little bit after you do so about how that went down.
Sure. So she was from right on the border of New Hampshire and Maine, and she was just upset that like a year ago, when mask mandates happened, she was really upset and got 10,000 signatures on change.org, which I'm sure most of us have seen or dealt with on Facebook or somewhere else. And then when Governor Mills decided to require health workers to get vaccinated, it took off again, and she got another 30,000 signatures. And I decided to just call her. I hadn't seen anything about it. And obviously it's not written and there's no recall process. So in a way it was, there wasn't a whole lot she could do with it, but people had given almost, I think, a more than like a couple $1,000s to her through change.org that she had no way to use. They would just promote it internally. And then because of that money, she had just felt really obligated to do something and couldn't. And also, I think it was an interesting experience, because at the same time, there are so many people who are frustrated with and angry towards people who won't get vaccinated or who won't wear masks. And I probably at times would fall into that category. But, at the same time, to know that she was completely powerless in a situation that she felt the people should have power in was interesting. And at the same time, knowing how people who feel this way think and what they're up to is one of the only ways you're ultimately going to get through a pandemic. So I was able to talk to someone at Maine who sort of was able to explain, what it takes to change someone's mind. He was a psychologist, and what it means to find common ground and be able to find a middle sector, even with people that you don't necessarily agree with. So I think that story took a bunch of twists and turns, but ultimately came out pretty good.
It did. And one of the old axioms, I guess, of journalism that I never really agreed with was you don't write about people on the margins like that because you empower them, you make them popular, you make their cause maybe more effective, all kinds of controversial positions. And this was one of the examples where you and I had to kind of walk through that a little bit. And yet I think it's important in every state that's going through this, because this is by no means a Maine only phenomenon, to understand all sides of people on this debate. I just think that's what journalists are here to do. And one thing I've been thinking about in light of this story, and it's a little bit off key, is if journalists maybe had done a better job leading up to the January 6th insurrection, maybe not only the Capitol Police and FBI wouldn't have been stunned about it, but none of us would have been stunned about it. I mean, these people were coming, they were coming for a reason, and we were all sort of, I can't believe this is happening. But maybe it's because we weren't necessarily doing stories like the one that I was proud that you did with this woman. So I just wanted to thank you for hanging in there. We got some feedback about this, Andrew, after that ran. Do you want to talk about that briefly before I go on to Kate?
Sure. Is it the feedback that we shouldn't have written it?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. So I got a couple emails that said we shouldn't have written the story, and I talked to Eric about it, because this is ultimately my first big job as a full-time reporter. So it was something that I guess first reader feedback in a way that we were empowering or doing too much or giving too much of a platform. And so Eric and I sat down and had a good conversation about it, and that we said very clearly in that story that vaccines were safe and that masks worked, and that had we not done those things, it could have done the wrong thing. But that the way it was written and the way that we approached it sort of made it necessary and helped actually use it to inform people rather than to just give someone's opinion a platform.
Stir people up. I agree. You handled that very well, Andrew. Thank you. So I want to move on to Kate. Kate Koff is also like Andrew, one of our newest reporters, but by no means is new to the state of Maine. And not only is she not new to the state of Maine, but her family has been here for no less than 8 generations. So she is a Mainer tried and true. She is on one of our, right up there with public health, one of our most sought after beats covering energy, climate, and the environment. Off to a great start. Kate, I wanted to talk to you about that. I want, your background before you came here was with the Mount Desert Islander and Ellsworth American. So you came here with a Maine background to journalism, to sort of a higher level, or at least more investigative journalism than what you did before. What made you, as a young up and coming journalist that you are, want to make that switch? What made the Monitor appealing to you?
Oh, well, this is my dream job. And first, thank you everybody for coming, for taking time out of your Thursday nights. I know we're all tired of Zoom, but we're very glad you're here. Yeah, so I, like Eric said, I was a reporter at the Ellsworth American and the Mount Desert Islander for, I think I was there for close to 4 years, and it was invaluable. It's we've been talking about the importance of local journalism. Those are true local papers, and I just learned so much, not only about journalism, but about being part of a community and what, being a local reporter in a community means, which is being accountable to the people who are there with you, who you see on the street every day. And so that was incredibly important. And but I always wanted to do a sort of more statewide reporting, and I always wanted to do longer, more investigative stories. And I'm really intrigued by the nonprofit model. I think that I think there's space for a lot of different models in the journalism world, but I think the nonprofit model is a good one, and I wanted to see, if I could make it work here and be a part of that. So yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled I made the move.
You grew up in Maine, and yet you went to two pretty prestigious colleges back to back: Bryn Mawr College outside of the big city of Philadelphia, one of my favorites, and Columbia University in New York. So big city experience from Maine, and yet come back to Bar Harbor where you live now. What's up with that?
Well, first I think my family is on here too. And I was so lucky to be able to do those things, and I wouldn't have been able to do them without their support. And Philadelphia and New York have this undeniable energy and vibrance, and they're wonderful places. But I love Maine for so many reasons. Of course I love it because it's beautiful. I love it because my family's here. But I really love living in smaller towns. That's not something I ever thought I would say as an adult, but I really do. I find it nourishing and challenging in a way. Sorry, this is my little puppy. I find it really nourishing and challenging to live in small communities. I love knowing my neighbors, and not that you can't have those things in those big cities. You certainly can, but they're different. And so that's why I wanted to come back.
I think that your journalism so far is an example of how investigative reporting doesn't always have to be 7,000 words long. And I'm thinking about a story you did recently about recycling in Maine, and how the state really doesn't even know how much recycling in Maine we're doing. Why don't you talk to our viewers a little bit about that story, what you found doesn't exist, that kind of thing, because it was a perfect example of we broke new ground. It was an investigative story, and yet it was just a good read.
Yeah, well, if you all follow my work for any period of time, you will learn that I love trash and recycling. This is my sort of my little pet project. I love those things. I think that the way that we deal with our solid waste and recycling says a lot about us as a society. So anyway, that story actually grew out of something that I did at the Ellsworth American, where I was sort of tangentially aware of that the state had this recycling data that every municipality is supposed to file a report every 2 years that says, it's just some basic information about where the town's recycling is going. They're recycling their solid waste, how much of it is going where, whether or not they have e-recycling, all those kinds of things. It's not a super long form. It's about 4 pages. And that set of reports is separate from the transfer station reports, which are much more detailed, and those are filled out by the transfer stations. So I was aware of these reports, and I asked for them. And the woman said, well, actually, out of 487 municipalities that were supposed to return these, we got, I think it was 147 or so. I don't remember the exact number. I'd have to go back and look. But I thought, well, that's very interesting. So she sent them to me over a number of emails, and I basically aggregated them. And it was somewhat of a tedious process because they were in a variety of different formats. Some were in PDFs and some were in Word files. And then I took all of the information and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet so that I could deal with it a little bit better. And I love data as well. So that's, especially in my beat, it really comes in handy to do stuff like that. And I was able to just analyze and take a look at it and see what it was actually telling us about the state of recycling. And I should say that, the state, because the information that comes in these reports is so sporadic, basically. I mean, they just don't have enough of it. They don't use that to actually calculate the recycling rate. They use the transfer station reports. But yeah, and so it was a really fun story to do. It was incredibly informative, and it kind of begs the question of how useful are these reports if we're not really getting that many of them? And I don't think they're overly time consuming for municipalities to do, but it does. Why do we have these? So it was a fun story to do.
All right, thank you, Kate. So, just for our viewers out there, these three people, among others, you're going to meet one of them soon, are the future of Maine journalism. And, I started this segment off by sort of saying how honored I am to pick up the legacy of John and Naomi and get the baton from Dan Dinsmore. But I'm equally honored to be working with this stage of my career with people that have so much to contribute, bright, fun, energetic. They know how I feel about them, and we're off to a great start, and I can't wait to go forward, keep it going forward. One thing about the Maine Monitor that might not be obvious to our viewers is, number one, we don't have a paywall. All the legacy papers now, all the legacy websites do. You don't have to pay to read our stuff. You never will have to pay. It's not what the nonprofit model's about. And I think that's really important. People of all strata from Maine, from elsewhere, can read us anytime they want to, and that kind of thing. Our daily newsletter is free as well. Number two, our megaphone is very loud in the sense that we have our loyal followers, and many of you are watching us tonight. But as is indicated earlier by Laura, after we publish our material every other Sunday, it is shared with the mainstream media in Maine and beyond. We now have 140 media contacts on that distribution list. We're getting picked up weeklies, websites, dailies, all over the place. So supporting our cause financially, we are a nonprofit with donations and those kinds of things. It really does, our kind of journalism really gets spread way more than you might think, because it's not just at our website. So without further ado, again, Andrew, Kate, Rose, thank you very much. I want to turn it over now to our good board member and good friend, Doug Warren, who will talk more about supporting the Maine Monitor.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and celebrating the accomplishments and the future of the Maine Monitor. I've been a financial supporter and Monitor board member for about 3.5 years. In that time, we've changed the name of the organization, hired a new editor, and really beefed up our reporting staff. In my opinion, really stepped up our game. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and why the Monitor is so important to me and to the entire state of Maine, I believe. I grew up in Brunswick, graduated from Brunswick High School in 1971, and graduated from college in 1975 with a degree in English and very little sense of what I wanted to do with my life. But I had been the editor of my high school newspaper, as Laura McCamblish knows well, and had written some obituaries for the paper in Northfield, Minnesota, where I was going to college. And I thought I wanted to write. So a week after graduation, I started working in Bridgeton, Maine, as the Western Maine correspondent for the Portland newspapers. I had very little idea what I was doing or what I was supposed to be doing. But I wound up spending nearly 6 years working in the Press Herald office, now which you may know as the Press Hotel, which I recommend highly, mostly as an editor and occasional music writer. I then got a job with the Miami Herald, where I worked for 5 years in the mid-1980s. It was an incredible news town. You could think Miami Vice, if any of you are old enough to remember that TV show. And I got to work with folks like Carl Hyacin, Dave Barry, and Edna Buchanan. And many of the people I worked with at that place in that time went on to run major newspapers across the country, and some are even continuing to do that today. I then spent 21 years at the Boston Globe in a variety of editing positions while covering major stories like 9/11, the shoe bomber, the death of JFK Jr., and the demise of the old man of the mountain. I don't know how many people remember that day, but I'll never forget it. I also worked closely with the Spotlight team that uncovered the clergy's sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of Boston. If you haven't seen Spotlight, which is the Oscar-winning movie about that effort, I highly recommend it. I saw firsthand the impact that investigative journalism can have, and I was fortunate to work during the heyday of newspapering. Somewhere here, I have a coffee mug that celebrates the Globe's Sunday print circulation of 816,000. Today, I'm sad to say that figure is not very far over about 100,000. I was there when the New York Times bought the Boston Globe for $1.1 billion. And then I later witnessed the sale of the paper to John Henry, the owner of the erstwhile Red Sox, for $250 million. Legacy media in Maine and across the country continues to do very important work, but the business model, thanks largely to the internet, is no longer sustainable, and our newspaper's ability to do time and money consuming investigative journalism is diminished, sadly. And that's why the work that's being done here by the Monitor and the people that you've seen this evening is so vitally important and so worthy of our support. The Monitor, under editor Eric Conrad, is totally focused on the kind of in-depth investigative journalism that you can't find anywhere else in Maine. Recent stories on the state's troubled public defender system and the failures of the Department of Health and Human Services to protect our most vulnerable children are just two outstanding examples. That's why I'm happy to volunteer my time and treasure to continue the Monitor's most important mission. I don't know about the rest of you, but I have a glass of wine at hand here. And I'd like to offer a toast to Naomi and to John and to Jed and the rest of the Monitor team and say thanks, and that here is to an outstanding future. With that said, I think I have a minute to spare, but I'll just say we'll now be taking a short 5-minute break, but don't leave, because coming up, we'll have a talk with two of our award-winning reporters, Samantha Hogan and Barbara Walsh, about their latest projects and what they see on the horizon. So I'd ask you to please stay tuned.
Hello, am I on now? Is that the idea? Okay, I'm Nick Mills. I'm a member of the board of directors of Maine Monitor. And I want to add my own toast and salute to John and Naomi, the founders, and for all the great work that they've done. I am just in awe that they did what they did and that the organization has survived despite perils and pitfalls for these many years and is now under the capable leadership of Eric Conrad. We're going to chat with a couple of star reporters, Samantha Hogan and Barbara Walsh. Hello, nice to see you, and great to have the opportunity to chat with you this evening. Samantha focuses on government accountability for the Maine Monitor. She joined the Monitor as its first full-time reporter in 2019 with Report for America, which is part of ProPublica's local reporting network. Samantha established herself as one of the state's top investigative reporters. She won honorable mention recognition for investigative reporting in a contest conducted by the National Institute for Nonprofit News. Congratulations.
Thank
Lovely
you.
achievement. And only 3 media outlets in the US competing in the Monitor's medium-sized category received such acclaim. The Monitor and Samantha were recognized for the year-long 2020 investigation into the Maine judicial system's approach to defending indigent people charged with crimes. And we'll get into talking about that in a bit. Barbara Walsh is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who has worked for newspapers in Ireland, wow, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Florida. And while working at the Lawrence Eagle Tribune, she reported on first, I don't know how many people remember the Willie Horton story in the presidential campaign, that one of the things that sank the Michael Dukakis campaign. Willie Horton and the flawed prison furlough system in Massachusetts. Barbara's reporting resulted in changes in the state sentencing laws and won a Pulitzer Prize. And during her career later at the Portland Press Herald, Maine Sunday Telegram, Barbara wrote in-depth stories on social issues in Maine, something she is still doing for Maine Monitor. And her stories have brought change. They've changed laws and earned national and state and regional awards. And I should mention that, Barbara, you also are the author of a biography / memoir called August Gale, A Father and Daughter's Journey into the Storm, and a children's book, Sammy in the Sky, illustrated by no less than Jamie Wyeth. Let me start with you, Barbara. Your current reporting for Maine Monitor includes child abuse, a series called Unsafe Homes, Children in Peril, and then suicides in rural northern Maine, Depths of Despair. 2 Maine babies and 2 toddlers died this past summer due to suspected abuse. 4 children dead of injuries which authorities say were inflicted by parents. The youngest of these, a month old, another was 6 weeks, the other 2 were 3 years old each. And Maine's only pediatric child abuse expert says that those 4 deaths are the tip of the iceberg. And you reported on a cluster of 4 suicides in northeastern Washington County. They died within a 2-month span last winter. 3 of them were young men. 1 was a 14-year-old boy. Very, very tough stories to read, let alone investigate and write about. Let's talk about the deaths of despair, the suicide cluster. What pointed you toward this story? How did it start for you as a reporter?
Well, thanks, Nick, for the intro. It's very kind. And my dad would be very happy that you mentioned August Gale. He's since passed on. But anyway, the suicides in Washington County kind of came about, during the pandemic. We kept hearing, anxiety was increasing, isolation, suicide attempts, ER visits for people of all ages were increasing. But for me, when I'm doing these stories, I don't like doing the generic, statistics. I always want to zoom in and find a human connection to that story. So I typically will just start calling, anywhere from 50 to 100 people to really find that compelling story that will illustrate what's going on throughout Maine. And so I learned after calls to, doctors, pediatricians, school teachers, and then also at the same time, we're experiencing high overdose deaths in Maine. So all of these people I was talking to, they said, well, in northeastern Washington County, during a 2-month period that began December 2020 and continued through January 2021, there were 4 suicides in 2 months. And one of them, they're all men, young men, and one of them was a 14-year-old boy. So the police chief in Baileyville, which is where the boy, 14-year-old, killed himself, was a friend to the boy. And this police chief was just torn apart and posted about these suicides, just saying, what did we miss? What can we do? And so, of course, he was one of my first people to go to. And, I went up there with a photographer and spent time talking to teachers, the family members who lost loved ones to suicide. And it was, a suicide's always difficult to write about because there's so many emotions surrounding it. But for me, it's tough to call a mother whose son, 28-year-old son shot himself and, speak to her. But those are the stories that I think convey the despair. And, during these interviews, you're on the phone. A lot of times the first interview and many interviews after, you're just listening to tears. You kind of get some story in between, but it's one of those pieces where, if you're going to honor that family, you need to make whatever it is, 10, 20 calls. I met her in person as well, but I interviewed school teachers who, close to this kid. But as a result, Washington County it's an isolated county. Not a lot of people go there. Professionals don't live there. And so this young man was trying to get help. The young boy who killed himself, the 14-year-old, couldn't be seen by counselors. And then the parents who lost a 28-year-old son, they couldn't get to see a counselor after their son's suicide. So it was just such despair, and highlighted how, mental health services throughout Maine and the country are really, hard to come by. But in Washington County, they were really struggling. And so as a result of the stories, it kind of bolstered their attempt to get NAMI, which is, the Maine chapter of National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, to begin a chapter there to offer group support, peer support. So it really can, I think, galvanize the community and gave them a voice, which, to me is always important.
But they sort of had to do it themselves, didn't they? They had
Right.
to, because a poor county and a poor state and the lack of services. And imagine these people have no access to counseling.
Right. And just months and months. And so it was, I think, just highlighted, and also, reminds politicians, people that, okay, we need to work on this. I mean, people's lives, 4 suicides in 2 months, and it's a small county.
Yeah, I'm also supposed to remind people that you can ask questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. And a little slip of the tongue or something, Report for America is not part of ProPublica. And I'm sorry I gave that impression. Report for America, the nonprofit that is funding anywhere from 20 to 50% of some of our reporters' salaries, provides them with training and support and more. So these individual events are very sad and very emotional subjects to deal with. And you had to deal face to face and over the phone with the survivors, the people in the community and families. How do you keep your emotions, your own emotions, in check dealing with stories like that?
Well, being Irish, I don't. My husband can tell you, I am, the Irish saying is, if you're not crying, you're cursing. But I, when I interview these people, and, I at first start off with, I'm sorry, and I will do my best to tell your story accurately, sensitively and fairly. But, there are times that, they may not know it, but as they're telling their story, I'm crying. And again, that emotion is not included in the story, but for me to write a story, I really want to feel it. I want to understand it as much as I can. I haven't lost, I have 2 daughters, and, you think of the pain that these people went through. And for me, it's trying to get the details that, convey that, and not, the details about the suicide necessarily, but what led up to it, what happened after, and the community ripple effect. So it's a lot of phone calls and repeated questions, to really get that story across.
And how did the families respond to you as an outsider asking about these intensely personal tragedies?
Well, it's funny. I think a lot of reporters, suicide is just still not something that people like to report on. And for me, it's something I feel, always should be looked at, because it's still taboo. There's a lot of blame and shame. And most often, these families want to talk, and they want to be heard, and they want to explain, you know, what led up to it and the pain after. And I think educating people, you know, a lot of people still believe suicide is very selfish. I mean, suicide is, you know, typically done because someone is in so much pain. So typically they're really eager to talk. And again, you know, after multiple conversations, I think they feel a lot of trust, which to me as a reporter, you know, it's so important to build that trust when you're doing these conversations.
Well, it resulted in a very powerful series. Let me move over to Samantha. You joined the Monitor in 2019, and you investigated Maine's public defender system, which is actually no system at all, as you discovered. They are supposed to require, Maine is supposed to provide counsel for indigent defendants who can't afford a lawyer when they're charged with some offense. How many of these are there? What are the numbers in this situation?
I mean, I could give you so many different numbers. We are swimming in data on this project, and you know, parsing it apart and finding the stories and finding the humans that are behind those numbers has really been the task for the past 2 years for me. And I want to thank Amy for throwing into the chat some clarification, which is that I am here with Report for America, which is a organization that places hundreds of journalists across the country in newsrooms to tell local stories. And when Dan and I were still within the first 2 months of me being hired here, and I turned to him and I said, are we really gonna write about lawyers? Like, the organization is just you and I and a couple of other people on the periphery, but you want me to dive into this story? You trust me? And he's like, I really trust you to tell this story. And I think that level of confidence has just made me pursue this story with a lot of passion. And we applied to the ProPublica Local Reporting Network, which was separate, and they paired me up with an amazing editor who helped us really dive into this. And we also successfully sued the state for data so that we could find out more about the state. And Jed Davis helped us with that lawsuit. Forever grateful for his legal services. But yeah, there are people behind every piece of data that we request and that the state collects. And for us, I think the starting point for that investigation was I was looking at discipline records for attorneys. And I had requested information about how much money lawyers had made in the past 6 years. And it had their names. And I was like, I wonder how many people cross over on these two lists. And I just started scrolling my fingers down and searching for names on the database, and I was surprised at how many names were cropping up. And of course, we eventually did that in a much more systematic way and found out that 26% of the attorneys that had been seriously disciplined in the prior 10 years were given a job as a court-appointed attorney for some of the most vulnerable individuals in our state who do not have the financial means to hire their own attorneys. In some of those cases, people were seriously sexually harassed. I'm forever grateful that Leah Kerwin decided to share her story with us about how, while facing multiple felony charges, she was being solicited by her attorney for sexual favors, and how that was not enough to get him disbarred in the state of Maine. And it just shows how egregious some of the acts can be. We also uncovered that an individual that had been charged and convicted of possessing child pornography was still representing people on appeals, and he was not disclosing, or he was not required to disclose in every instance to his clients that he was a registered sex offender. And, you know, when I think about being that vulnerable and being in someone's shoes like that, where I'm facing a jail term or a prison term, and I have no real say in who's being assigned to me as my lawyer, you can just immediately see how it's really important that there be some oversight. And unfortunately, the government wasn't doing it. And so I think we stepped in and did a real public service by shining a spotlight on this.
Well, the commission, Maine Commission on Indigent Legal Services, is responsible for training and supervising private attorneys to defend the poor. But what sort of training and supervision do they actually get?
Well, training is, they do offer some basic training for new people that are being rostered, people that are being made eligible to accept these cases. But what we had found was that the agency was being run by 3 people, and they were overseeing hundreds of contracted attorneys, and they were overseeing thousands of clients a year, on the scale of 20 to 30,000 cases a year. And so there really was no supervision. They did not physically have enough bodies in the building to supervise these attorneys in courtrooms dispersed across the state. And that has been some of the direct outcomes of our reporting, is that there was bipartisan support to increase staffing at this state agency. They gave more money to attorneys to attract higher quality attorneys to work on these cases. And then they have completely revamped their training program that they are going to be offering moving forward. That got a little delayed by COVID, but the writing's on the wall that that's coming as well. So we lawmakers were in agreement that things needed to change in MCILS, and that did not fall along partisan lines. That was something that everyone came together last session. I remember being up at 1:30 in the morning watching the House unanimously pass the bill. So we are there at all hours.
Yeah, and they didn't get all the money that they wanted. They got about, what, roughly half of it, what they had originally asked for.
Yeah, so the commission had asked for a substantial amount of money. They essentially said that they were going to ask for everything and the kitchen sink. And at that point, quite frankly, they needed it. And I think when you're looking at a pandemic budget, or any year when you're at a risk of a recession, you don't know what kind of federal money is coming in yet, you are going to take a slightly conservative approach. Those bills are not completely dead. I expect us to see the conversation about establishing the state's first public defender office to come up either this session or next session. And I guess it depends on which way the governor's race goes. But Paul LePage has supported in the past versions of public defender offices if he ultimately does become the Republican nominee, or if he's elected governor again. And then Janet Mills is the state's former attorney general. She is very aware of the people sitting on the other side of the courtroom and the constitutional need to provide a defense. So I don't think that it's beyond the realm of possibility that both of the potential gubernatorial nominees or possible people that we'll see on our ballot are very aware of this issue.
By the way, I am not related to Janet Mills, which, if we happen to be in the same room together, she is all too quick to point out for my taste. Obstacles. Investigative journalism stories are rife with running into stone walls and other obstacles. Let me go back to Barbara for a second. In your reporting, did you encounter obstacles to finding out what you needed to find out?
In the series on the suicides and overdoses up in Washington County, not from interviewing, but with the more recent stories with the child deaths in Maine, you mentioned the 4 kids that died in a 3-month period. This story that I try to steer away from is the finger pointing that, politicians are saying, the system's broken, DHS is not being, transparent with information. So I did try to request information, but with those 4 child deaths, for me as a reporter, again, we had names, we had some details, but I always want more to put, we knew that DHS was involved in most of these kids and the families, like Maddox Williams, which, they're all heartbreaking, but he was, beaten to death, and his mother was charged with the murder. He was 3.5 years old when he died. So I managed to get his grandmother, paternal grandmother, to talk and learn that, his life from the beginning, his mother had previous DHS involvement. He was born weighing 3 pounds because the mother chose to leave the hospital. So at the very start of his life, just this tragedy kept unfolding. And he went home with the mother until she had 3 other kids. Police came to the home. I learned after a 2-year-old in their home had overdosed on methadone. So eventually, Maddox ended up back with his dad and back and forth for various reasons. But it was just, learning the tragic details and the fact that, DHS certainly had plenty of time to kind of put this kid in a safe home. So for me, you never go to the state because you're not going to get the answers there. And it's always family members, people who know the case that you've got to go through. And so that was kind of how I got around, stories like that.
Yeah. Samantha, you mentioned earlier that you had to sue the state because they were stonewalling you in what aspect of the story?
So the state uses a database to track every single case that MCILS is taking on and the individual steps that attorneys take within those cases and ultimately what they end up billing for. And that's a simplified version of what's in that database. But we really wanted to, because Maine doesn't have any electronic court records, it was a matter of me going to courthouses across the state and pulling individual files, hoping that I could piece together a narrative, that I could get a full picture of what had happened. And we had questions about what the quality of defense that individuals had received. And there was also concerns that attorneys were billing too many hours physically on the same day. And we raised financial questions. And I don't know if anyone read our article that we published with ProPublica in February of this year, but essentially once we got our hands on that data, we were able to run an analysis to find out whether or not people were properly qualified to take the most serious cases that MCILS was assigning to attorneys. So murders, sex offenses, something called serious violent felonies that the state prosecutes, and finding out whether or not the attorneys had the appropriate years of experience. And that was all information that once we had that data, once we sued and got a copy of the physical database, we were able to look at all of those different factors. And we found out that at least 2,000 cases had gone to attorneys that were not properly qualified. So it was a challenge for sure. And we were getting stonewalled on initially not wanting to release this data for a number of reasons. But once we had it on hand, we were able to quantify something that had been happening for 5 years or something that had been happening for a decade. And then it's finding those individual cases again, telling those people's stories, finally, often alerting them for the first time that the process had not worked perfectly for them. And unfortunately, some of these guys had ended up in prison or, had had a lot of other collateral consequences in their life. And so it just paints a much fuller picture of what justice means in this state. And I think that's the importance of why I've been doing this reporting.
Have any of the people who were convicted of crimes sued because they were denied competent counsel? I mean, they have a constitutional right to competent counsel.
So that is one thing that I looked at to see whether or not the Maine Supreme Court had reviewed any appeals for ineffective assistance of counsel, is what they technically call it. And we did not find it overlapping with those 2,000 cases. We did not find an obvious example of that. However, the ACLU of Maine has been pretty vocal with our organization that they are getting incredibly close to filing a lawsuit against the state of Maine. And they have been for a while in regards to the lack of a public defender system. And so what they struggled with as well is finding these cases and actually quantifying what the state had been doing in the 10 years that it had the system in place. And so I think they see it as ripe for abuse as we saw it. And there's change, but I think that the state will not avoid a full out lawsuit. It doesn't look that way.
Well, Barbara and Samantha, both of you are doing stories with great impact and stories that cry out for change at the state level. I suppose you're never quite satisfied with the amount of change that you may bring about with your stories, but it has happened. I mean, you have made an impact, Barbara.
I hope so. I mean, as a journalist, that's your goal is that, you know, your stories echo in the community, in the state, and across the country too. And sometimes you really don't know, you know, that how it affected one person, or saved a life, or changed laws, or did something. But that's the goal, is that, you know, you give voice to the voiceless, and you give meaning to people's experiences. And you know, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you find out, sometimes not.
And
That's the
Samantha,
goal.
your reporting it certainly has had an impact at the state level. I'm sure that the legislature was paying attention and reading those stories and saying, well, we better do something.
Well, it's always fun. It's always fun when a lawmaker references your reporting in a public hearing, for sure. But I'll just say, like, I read Barbara's series every single time, and I'm affected by it. And I think that that's what's beautiful about the Maine Monitor, is that we're telling human stories and giving voice. We're not giving voices to people, but we're amplifying voices of people that are already out there that have a story to share. And that's why I really believe in the mission of the Maine Monitor, and its ability to find and dig into these important topics that maybe are just being glossed over or just being looked at the surface by some of our other colleagues in the media, and to just do great journalism, great local journalism.
And you're doing it. You're both doing it. Barbara and Samantha, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to finally get to talk with you. We don't do that in the age of COVID. We haven't had a chance to get together and discuss journalism or anything else. So thank you for your excellent work for Maine Monitor, and back to Eric.
Well, thank you, Nick. I just wanted to, I think Barbara, Nick, you, and Samantha all touched on something that I think is important for our viewers to know, and that is, number one, it takes time to do the kind of projects and have the kind of impact that Samantha and Barbara have, and that really all of us at the Maine Monitor have. And Samantha talked about lawsuits and legal things and filing freedom of access. That takes money in some cases too. So for our viewers out there who are donors, thank you very much. That's where your donations go. They make the difference that Nick, Barbara, and Samantha are talking about. And for those of you who are viewers that are thinking about making donations, that's where your money would go. If we make a difference, we try to make a difference at the Maine Monitor, and those things take money. I do want to echo what Samantha said a little bit earlier. The importance of Report for America cannot be overstated in our newsroom. Dan Dinsmore did a great job cementing these relationships. I hope to continue it. But without them, we would not have 4 full-time reporters. It's that simple. We would not be making the difference that we do. They are an independent organization. I would encourage you to go for their website and look it up yourself. They have reporters all across this country, and I think they're getting ready to go beyond this country if they haven't already. And I just want to say thank you very much to the RFA group, the organization, and I'm still getting to know. We wouldn't have that opportunity. So Nick, I'll turn it over to you to segue to Laura, and on behalf of everybody at the Monitor, before Laura wraps it up, thanks for tuning in tonight.
All right, and yeah, you're right, and it's wonderful that when the legacy media began to diminish because of pressures from the internet and so forth, that organizations did step up, and like Report for America and ProPublica, the 1,000-pound gorilla in the field of independent nonprofit journalism. It's great that these organizations are created and have stepped up to try and fill the gaps that the legacy media can no longer fill. So segue to Laura. Is that how I do it? Segue to Laura?
Yes, hello again, everyone. And it was so great to hear from all of our reporters you can share this video recording. It will be archived at mainemonitor.org. So tell all your friends and colleagues, and go to the website and sign up for our daily Monitor newsletter. It's the best news source in Maine. We have about 5,000 subscribers there, which we're really looking for business underwriting partners who will be highlighted in that newsletter to go out to our 5,000 subscribers and growing. So we have so many great locally owned businesses here in Maine, small businesses that have grown alongside the Monitor. So please tell anyone you know in the business community that might be able to help in that role. We're funded by grants and donations, and we continue to seek those out, including from a number of Maine-based foundations. And we're so grateful to all of you for joining us here tonight. If you have any further questions, you can type them to Eric. Follow up by email. Follow us on social media. And no worries if you're not on social media. The website is a great way to follow us. Look forward to being in touch.